The Lawyer's Dilemma. A man of integrity. Michael Donovan was a lawyer of high repute, known throughout the city for his unwavering honesty and commitment to justice. He had always taken pride in his work, believing that every individual deserved a fair trial and that the truth should prevail no matter the cost. His wife, Sarah, and their 10-year-old daughter, Emily, shared his values and supported his endeavors, even when it meant late nights and long hours away from home. One fateful day, Michael was approached by a desperate man named Victor, who pleaded for his help. Victor's brother had been wrongfully accused of murder, and the real perpetrators were a notorious criminal gang led by the ruthless Ricardo Morales. Michael, compelled by his sense of justice, took on the case, despite knowing the danger it posed. As Michael delved deeper into the case, strange things began to happen. His car was vandalized, cryptic messages were left on his doorstep, and anonymous phone calls filled the silence of the night with threats. Undeterred, Michael pressed on, determined to expose the truth. One evening, as Sarah was preparing dinner and Emily was doing her homework, the phone rang. Sarah answered, only to hear a chilling voice on the other end, "Tell your husband to drop the case, or you'll all pay the price." Sarah's hands trembled as she hung up, her heart pounding with fear. She told Michael about the call, but he reassured her, believing it was an empty threat meant to scare them. Little did he know, the real terror was about to begin. A week later, as Emily was walking home from school, a black van pulled up beside her. Before she could react, masked men grabbed her and dragged her inside. The van sped away, leaving her backpack lying on the sidewalk. When Sarah arrived to pick her up and found Emily missing, panic set in. She called Michael, her voice trembling with fear. Michael's world shattered at that moment. The gang had taken his daughter. Desperation and rage filled his heart, but he knew he had to stay calm and think strategically. He contacted the police, but their resources were limited against such a powerful and elusive gang. Michael received a message from Ricardo Morales himself, offering a trade, Emily for his withdrawal from the case. Michael knew he couldn't trust Morales, but he had no choice. He agreed to meet at a deserted warehouse on the outskirts of town. That night, Michael arrived at the warehouse, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, he found Emily tied to a chair, her eyes wide with fear. Ricardo and his men stood around her, smirking. "You should have listened, Donovan," Ricardo sneered. But Michael had a plan. Unbeknownst to Ricardo, he had secretly recorded their previous conversation and sent it to a trusted friend who was an investigative journalist. The police were on their way. As Ricardo realized this, chaos erupted. Michael fought fiercely, using everything in his power to protect Emily. He managed to untie her and urged her to run. In the confusion, they escaped into the dark woods behind the warehouse. The sound of gunshots echoed in the night, and they ran for their lives, dodging bullets and praying for safety. Exhausted and terrified, Michael and Emily finally reached a nearby town where they were found by the police. Ricardo and several of his men were arrested, but the ordeal left deep scars on Michael's family. Michael knew they could never return to their old life. They entered a witness protection program, adopting new identities and moving to a different part of the country. Despite the trauma, they found solace in their new beginning, grateful to be alive and together. Years later, Michael Donovan, now living under a new name, continued his fight for justice in a quieter, safer way. The memories of that harrowing experience never left him, but it made him more determined to stand up against corruption and evil. He had faced terror and emerged stronger, a testament to the power of resilience and the unbreakable bond of family. Years had passed since Michael Donovan, now living under the alias Thomas Carter, had faced off against Ricardo Morales and his gang. He, his wife Sarah, and their daughter Emily had settled into a quiet life in a small town, far from the horrors they had endured. But the past has a way of creeping back into the present, and the shadows were about to return with a vengeance. One cold autumn evening, as the family gathered for dinner, the phone rang. Thomas answered, expecting a call from a friend or a neighbor. Instead, he heard a familiar, chilling voice. "You thought you could escape, Donovan. We're coming for you." Thomas's blood ran cold. He recognized the voice instantly. It was Ricardo Morales. How had he found them? Panic gripped him, but he didn't want to alarm Sarah and Emily. He hung up, his mind racing with thoughts of how to protect his family once again. The next few days were filled with unease. Thomas noticed a black SUV parked near their house, its occupants watching them intently. He received cryptic messages and threatening notes left at their doorstep. He knew they were being watched, but he couldn't go to the police. They had already done so much to protect them. One night, as Emily slept in her room, she was awakened by a tapping on her window. She saw a shadowy figure standing outside, staring at her with piercing eyes. She screamed, and Thomas and Sarah rushed to her room. The figure was gone, but the fear lingered. Thomas decided it was time to leave. They packed their belongings and fled in the dead of night, driving aimlessly until they found a remote cabin deep in the woods. It was old and abandoned, but it offered the seclusion they needed. Thomas set up makeshift security measures and stayed vigilant, but the sense of dread never left him. The cabin, however, held secrets of its own. Strange things began to happen. At night, they heard whispers in the walls and footsteps on the creaky floors, but no one was there. Doors opened and closed on their own, and the air grew colder with each passing day. Emily spoke of seeing ghostly figures in her room, but Thomas and Sarah dismissed it as nightmares. One evening, as Thomas was chopping wood outside, he felt a presence behind him. He turned to see a pale, ghostly figure staring at him with hollow eyes. It was a woman, her face twisted in anguish. She reached out to him, and then vanished into thin air. Thomas was shaken, but he didn't tell Sarah or Emily, not wanting to frighten them further. Sarah, meanwhile, discovered an old journal hidden in the cabin's attic. It belonged to the previous owner, a man named Jonathan Gray, who had lived there with his wife and daughter. The entries revealed a dark history. The family had been tormented by a malevolent spirit that ultimately drove Jonathan to madness. He had killed his wife and daughter before taking his own life, cursing the cabin with their restless spirits. The realization that they were not alone, that they were living amidst vengeful ghosts, horrified Sarah. She showed the journal to Thomas, who finally confessed about seeing the ghostly figure. They were trapped, haunted not only by Ricardo Morales but by the supernatural as well. One stormy night, the terror reached its peak. The ghostly apparitions became more aggressive, throwing objects, shaking the cabin, and whispering threats. Amidst the chaos, the black SUV returned, and Ricardo Morales and his men stormed the cabin. A brutal confrontation ensued. Thomas fought desperately to protect his family, but the ghosts, driven by their own tormented rage, turned their attention to Ricardo and his men. The apparitions became tangible, attacking with a fury that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. Thomas, Sarah, and Emily used the distraction to escape. They ran through the stormy woods, the sounds of screams and supernatural wails echoing behind them. They found refuge in a nearby town and finally contacted the authorities, who discovered the carnage at the cabin. Ricardo Morales was never found. His men were discovered dead, their bodies twisted in unnatural ways, their faces frozen in expressions of sheer terror. The cabin was declared haunted and left abandoned, a monument to the horrors that had transpired there. Thomas vowed never to take on another dangerous case, dedicating his life to his family and their safety. But in the quiet moments, when the wind howled through the trees, they couldn't help but wonder if the shadows of the past would ever truly let them go. Like, subscribe and share for more interesting stories.